John chapter number 4, and we'll begin reading verse 1. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee, and he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which giveth us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water, springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Jesus saith unto her, Go, call thy husband, and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh, when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Jesus saith unto her, I that speaketh unto thee am he. And upon this came his disciples, and marveled that he talked with the woman. Yet no man said, What seekest thou, or why talkest thou with her? The woman then left her water pot, and went her way into the city, and saith to the men, Come, see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? This morning, I want to preach a message, second part of a message, the subject of some truths about worship. In the first part, I not only covered the introduction, but also answered the question, why does God need to be worshipped? And in that message, I I brought up the fact that God is sovereign, and brought out the fact that He doesn't need anything from us or from angels. But today what I'd like for us to consider is why do we need to worship? And really I want to bring out the why of worship. So as I mentioned last time, the word worship is used frequently in our language. A lot of times people will mention the word worship, even in Christian circles. We find the word worship being brought up in phrases like worship services. We find the word family worship. We find sometimes worship choruses. We find worship teams, worship manuals, worship seminars. We find the word being thrown around a lot of different ways. In everyday language, sometimes we'll hear people saying, well, he worships the ground that she walks on, talking about how much in love that somebody is with his girlfriend or something like that. And so the word does get thrown around a lot, and I'm afraid that folks a lot of times don't even know what the word worship even means. And then, as I mentioned, whenever somebody asks us a question like, why does God need to be worshipped? Or even why do we worship? Or why do you go to the worship services? Which is another way of saying the question of why do you go to church? Because is not that what church service is? The worship service? We really need to understand what do they mean by worship. What are they even asking? Because sometimes people don't even understand what worship is. And so we need to understand what people are talking about, because as we read here in John chapter 4, Jesus had needs, as he said, he must needs go through Samaria. And this lady, as he was talking to her, he tells her, "Ye worship ye know not what," in verse 22. And oftentimes that happens. Remember early on in the book of Acts, if you go to Acts chapter 16, Acts chapter 16 and verse 14, you'll hold your place there in John and go to Acts chapter 16 and verse 14. It says, "A certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized, and her husband, she besought us, saying, If ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us." This Lydia, she was there. She was worshiping God, but apparently she didn't understand what she was doing, because it tells us that the Lord opened her heart there. She was saved at that point. And of course, then you go into Acts chapter 17 and find the Athenians worshiping the unknown God. And so there are many folks who don't understand what worship is all about. They don't even understand the God who they are worshiping. Even in Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. Verses 7, 8, and 9. Jesus said, "Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." So you and I, we got up this morning. We got dressed up. We came to church. We came to the worship service because as we enter into the building, that is what it's for. It is for the worship of God. And worship is God-centered. At King's Edition, we used to have a sign in the door as we came into the door. It said, "Enter to worship." As we left, it said, "Exit to serve." It was a reminder of what was happening. Because sometimes, as people, we need reminded. Even as God's people. No matter how seasoned of Christians we may be, sometimes we need reminded of these things. Because in our country, the church services have become very man-centered, not God-centered. Think about it. The church services have become very much a social gathering. It's become a great attention to details. And there should be attention to details, but sometimes the attention becomes on the wrong details. The music, the style, the attractions. Excuse me. The shows. The gimmicks and the games. Even those of us who would look down on the contemporary styles, we've got to be careful because sometimes we're not much better. What do we think when we have a visitor that comes among in our midst? We worry what the visitor thinks. We worry about what the preacher might say, afraid that he might get offended. We worry about what the song choices, afraid that he might not know the songs. We worry that he might not be pleased because there's not very many of us. We worry about what he thinks. After the service, we might be apt, depending on how well we know him, to ask him what he thought. Yet I wonder how often we wonder or ask God what he thought. Worship is to be God-centered, not man-centered. Let us consider about our buildings. Our buildings we get excited about the stained glasses. We don't have stained glasses, but I'm talking about our circles. We get excited about the stained glasses, the decorations, the costly hangings. Is all this really for the worship of God? Or is it because we love it so? And God help us if we ever get separated from the building itself. In America, we have associated the building with the worship of God for so long that I fear that in this country, that if the buildings were ever taken away from modern day, I'm not even going to say modern day Christianity, I'm going to say regular Baptists, God's church, the Lord's churches, if the buildings were ever taken away from us, we would wonder, what in the world would we ever do? How would we worship God? But the reality of it is, according to this book, the early churches met without a building. They worshiped God without a building. Padded pews are nice, and I thank God for them. A great pulpit's a blessing. But we can meet and worship God in homes. I can preach from a folding table. We can sit in folding chairs. And if it comes down to it, we can meet in caves if we have to worship God. And let us remember, worship is not evangelism. And what I mean by that is this: it's not about attracting a crowd. If that's what it's about, we've done failed. And we failed a long time ago. As what I said before is in the first message, and I'll say it again, it's about God. So should it be a surprise to us when the world doesn't want to come to church? Should it be a surprise to us when visitors come and then they don't come back? Certainly, we ought to invite folks to church, and don't ever quit doing that. But that's not soul winning. We need to be telling about Jesus Christ. We need to be pointing folks to the cross, not telling folks how comfortable the pews are or whether or not we've got a nursery. You look at the advertisements of some churches, and man, they're telling about how that they've got nurseries, and they've got basketball gyms, and they've got this and that. We need to be telling people about the Lord outside of these four walls. Tell them about the Lord, and at the end of your conversation, invite them to come to church. But point them to the cross first. And worship is not about socialization. The people in the pew, they ought to be your friends. But it ought not to be about coming to church to meet up with and to catch up with everything that's gone on through the week. We ought to be here to worship the Lord. Notice our text in John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. John chapter 4 and verses 23 and 24. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. First of all, to worship in spirit is to worship spiritually, and to worship in truth is to worship truly. Very simple understanding of the English here. These are not two different kinds of worship. This is rather two aspects of the same worship. To worship spiritually is the opposite of the fleshly kind of worship that we find so prevalent in our world today. To worship him truly is to worship him according to the truth, the way he is revealed in his word. In John chapter 17, you'll hold your place in John 4. John 17 in verse 17, he says, "Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth." You remember we studied a lot in Romans where he said that the world is without excuse because of the world and the Creator, the creation. The creation reveals to the world that there is a Creator, but it don't tell the world about who he is. It doesn't tell the world about anything about how he is to be worshipped. It doesn't tell the world about his name. It doesn't tell them about redemption or about Jesus Christ. Only that there is a God, that he created the world. You want to know anything about worship? You want to know anything about the redemption? You've got to get into this book. And the only way you'll understand these things is that it's revealed to you. And you want to worship him in a way that's pleasing. You've got to do it according to his word. You go out in this world and you'll find all sorts of different ways of worship. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Notice that word must. It's a big word. We can't overlook it. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. There's no alternative, no choice, no other way. Interestingly enough, there's two other musts that come before this one in relation to they kind of fit along with this in the book of John. The first one's in John chapter 3 and verse 7. John 3 verse 7, he says, "Marvel not that I said unto thee, ye must be born again." So you must be born again. So this first must that we find here has to do with the work of the Holy Spirit in the new birth. You must be born again. The next one is in verse 14 of John chapter 3. And it says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." The second must has reference to Jesus, who died for sinners. And the third here in our text references the Father. He is the one, the object of worship, the one who seeks worshipers. The order is important and cannot change. Worshiping God is a mark then of one who's been born again, one who has been covered by the blood of Christ. Think about it for a moment. As I mentioned, you got up this morning, you got ready, you came to church. Why? You didn't have a desire to do that before. But you did this morning. Why? Because of what? Because of your new nature. Because of what Jesus has done for you. This order cannot be changed. In Proverbs chapter 15, Proverbs chapter 15 and verse number 8 says, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight." A.W. Pink defined worship like this. He said, "First, it is the action of the new nature seeking, as the sparks fly upward, to return to the divine and heavenly source from which it came. We love him because he first loved us." Worship is one of three great marks which evidences the presence of the new nature. Philippians chapter number 3. I'm going to go over there with me for a moment. Philippians 3 and verse 3. "For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit and rejoice in Christ Jesus and have no confidence in the flesh." Worship God in the Spirit, rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. Worship is the activity of redeemed people. Think back to the Old Testament. You ever consider the fact that in Egypt, the people of Israel did not worship Jehovah in Egypt? There they could only sigh and groan and cry. It was not until Israel had passed through the Red Sea that they got to Exodus chapter number 15 and verse number 1. We go back there, Exodus 15 and verse 1. "Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea." And then thirdly, worship proceeds from the heart. Worship is the redeemed heart occupied with God, expressing itself in adoration and thanksgiving. If you continue reading through Exodus chapter 15, this is the redemption song, or the song of Moses, if you will. Notice the frequent repetition of thou and thee and he. worship is all about God. It's not about me. It's not about the flesh. It's all about Him. Why worship? Because I'm saved. Why worship? Because of what Jesus has done. Why worship? Because I've been born again. Because I'm a new creature. Worship is not by the eyes or ears. It's in spirit and in truth. The more spiritual our worship, the less formal and less attractive to the flesh it will be. When we consider these things, we understand why it is that God's people have always sought out to worship God throughout all ages, going all the way through the Old Testament into the New. No matter the dangers, no matter what was going on, worship God. Not only in the good times, but also in the bad times as well. We find that to be true, but always may we worship Him in spirit and in truth. May the Lord bless you with this message. Brother Isaiah, would you please pray for us?
Dear God, thank you for the wonderful sermon that you laid on Daddy's heart.